IDC Radio 106.2 FM. IDC Radio, in collaboration with Kol Israel.
Hello and welcome on ICT Roundtable discussion on IDC Radio 106.2 FM. Also on the internet, www.1062fm.co.il. On December 18, 2010, a young Tunisian with the name Mohamed Bouzi put himself on fire to protest against police corruption and ill treatment in Tunisia. The process started in Tunisia, and affected countries include, among others, Egypt, Libya, and Syria. We're today with distinguished experts that I will present shortly, and with them, we're going to analyze the Arab Spring or Islamist winter, the process and its ramification on terrorism. We're going to discuss who are the actors involved in this process, what is really the Muslim Brotherhood, who is now taking a lead in various elections throughout the region. Is Al-Qaeda really playing a role in this process? Where is Israel standing in all of this? And what are the consequences from a regional, international perspective of the Arab Spring? But before starting, I would like to introduce the experts who are here with us today. Dr. Boaz Ganor is the Ronald S. Lauder Chair in Counterterrorism, the founder and executive director of the ICT, the International Institute for Counterterrorism, and the Deputy Dean of the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy here at the IDC Herzliya. We're also here with Dr. Amichai Magen, the Head of Political Development and a Senior Researcher at the ICT. He's also a adjunct professor at the IDC Herzliya. We're also here with Dr. Assaf Moghadam, a Senior Researcher at the ICT and a Senior Lecturer at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy. He was also, before coming here to Israel, the former Director of Terrorism Studies at the Combating Terrorism Center at the West Point Military Academy. Last but not least, we're also here with Dr. Reuven, a Research Fellow at the ICT and the Director of the Project for the Research of Islamist Movement, PRISM. I'm Stevie Weinberg, and I'm a researcher at the ICT. Boaz, I would like to ask the first question to you. Many people are seeing this process as a democratic revolution. There is a lot of enthusiasm that is following that. But do you agree with that? Do you think that we're really witnessing a democratic process throughout this region now?
Stevie, I believe that in order to ask this question and to answer it, we need to define what is a democratic process and what is democracy altogether. Some people tend to refer to democracy as if this is an institution in which you have free election, the majority is electing the decision makers, and that creates democracy. I tend to believe that democracy, liberal democracy, is first and foremost a set of values. It's a combination of civil society. It's respect for human rights, for the rights of the minorities, for women's leave, and so on and so forth. Democracy is, of course, has to do with free election, but this is not the only, or maybe not even the most important essence of this phenomenon. I tend to believe that when fundamentalists in general are taking over and governing a country through free election, that's A, legitimize them, or so-called legitimizing them. B, it's a dangerous process because this is a democracy which a person has one man, one vote, and one time. They would not leave their position in a democratic way, only through bloodshed. So when I'm watching this process, which was called, still some people refer to that as the Arab Spring, I'm asking myself, is this really promoting liberal democracy? And I tend to believe that the answer is, at least for now, negative, or at least yet to be seen. I'm asking the question, could a Sharia law-governed state be a democracy, a liberal democracy? And on that, I also answer negatively, because what is the essence of sovereignty in a Sharia law-governed state? who decides who should run the country? Is the majority of the voters, the majority of the citizens, the constituency, or this is God himself? Take, for example, Sharia law governed state like Iran. And you have Ahmadinejad that won the election, free or not, is questionable, but let's say for the sake of the argument that it was free election. Does he run the country? Does he is the supreme leader of the country? Or it's Khamenei that was elected by whom? By God. So I would like to argue that the concept of Sharia law governed state is contradictory to liberal democracy altogether. And unfortunately, many people around the world do not accept this idea. I can quote a discussion I held a few years ago with Condoleezza Rice, in which she said the Sharia law governed state doesn't have to be non-democratic government. And I tend to believe that it has to be. What we see today in the Arab Spring, that it's leading to Sharia law governed states. As such, I'm very concerned with the relationship of those new Sharia law governed states with the apparatus of a liberal democracy.
Thank you, Boaz. Amichai, you spent most of your academic career studying political development, state in transition, and so on. So the question I want to ask you is very simple. What are the main tenets of democracy promotion in states in transition, and how do you ensure political and democratic stability in our region?
I think there's a consensus that democracy, almost by definition, is a domestic process rather than an international process. The international community can support, it can provide financial aid, it can provide technical aid, it can send monitors to make sure that elections are free and fair. It can help establish independent courts. It can help establish and support a vibrant civil society. But all of those are like fuel, like gas, like petrol to a car. But if the car doesn't exist, if the infrastructure of democracy, the values of democracy, as Boaz rightly articulated them, are not in place, then the international community can do very, very little. And some people would even argue would only do harm, because all this international aid would actually help sustain and lodge into place anti-democratic, anti-liberal elites. I think that a year ago, the international community and people in the region were far more enthusiastic about the opportunity that opened up. The notion, the adage of the Arab Spring was based on the European experience of 1848, the Spring of Nations, and then of 1989, the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe from Soviet domination. A year on, we see that not only are we not moving towards liberal democracy, but it is even questionable whether we are moving towards a new type of stable authoritarianism. It seems to me that the dominant trend that is emerging from Libya to Syria to Yemen to Sudan to Lebanon to Sinai is one of state failure and collapse of governance, whether autocratic or democratic.
It seemed that throughout the region was seeing, as a result of the Arab Spring, two different types of movement that are really rising and gaining influence. The first one is the Muslim Brotherhood. The second one, and maybe at a different level, is the Salafist. Reuven, I'm turning to you now, and I wanted, if you can you discuss a little bit the Muslim Brotherhood? What are their goal, their ideology? Because it's important to understand that in order to understand what is really happening today in our region.
Well, we don't have enough time to review the entire history and ambitions of the Muslim Brotherhood, but let me start first. I think, as an answer to Boaz, I think that it is a total mistake to compare between the Sunni world and Iran. The Muslim Brotherhood, the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, are not seeking any rule that is similar to Khamenei or Khomeini at a time, and this is a different story. Another thing, we have to take into consideration that this is not democracy. This is not pro-democracy. These are processes of anti-dictatorship. The guy who set fire or burned himself in Tunisia didn't think, he thought about revenge. He didn't think about creating a wave by the way, just to mention one unique issue, pay attention that he burned himself. He committed suicide. Not suicide operation like we are used from the other,
Shahid, yeah.
but he committed suicide like the Buddhist monks in Vietnam and Cambodia at the 60s and 70s and 80s. Or Jan Palach in Czechoslovakia, in Prague, in 1968 against the Soviet occupation. But returning to the Muslim Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, there are several unique factors that I think we should mention here. First, in any of these, of the branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, there is no charismatic leader. All the branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, either Hamas or in Egypt or in Morocco and Jordan, there is only a collective leadership so far. And the collective leadership is much more, let's say, tended much more to listen to the people, to reflect the wishes of the people. And the Muslim Brotherhood in general were always working with, let's say, according to what they call al-maslaha al-amma, the interest of the public, the general interest of the public. And this is something important, because in some way there might be an Islamic dictatorship, but not in the lines of what we were used to, like Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and Assad the father and the son, etc. And I would like also to pay attention to the fact that the only two countries where there is a real violence right now, or in the past, in the near past, and right now, I mean Libya and Syria, there were the worst dictators. If we go to Egypt under Mubarak, or if we go to Tunisia under Ben Ali, these were not, with all the complaints against them, these were not the worst dictators. And there, and in Egypt, in Tunisia, if something happens, and it may happen also in Jordan and Morocco, for example, I don't expect there to be such a violence like in Syria, because again, the two kings are not regarded as worst dictators. And another point,
the last point,
I want you to pay attention. The Muslim Brothers, the Brotherhood, became in the past 30, maybe even 40 years, the only defender of human rights and civil rights in the Arab world. There is no Arab left. The Arab liberals are very, very weak, and the only, even in the Palestinian Authority, when they won the elections vis-à-vis the Fatah, they were regarded the defenders of human rights and civil rights, and therefore their popularity is far beyond the Islamic missions.
Thank you, Reuven. Before moving to Assaf, I want to move back to Boaz Ganor. Boaz Ganor, do you have anything to respond to Reuven's analysis?
Yeah, I just want to mention that, at least in my view, to say that the Muslim Brotherhood reflects the people's will, it might be a little bit problematic, because they might reflect the people's will. No doubt about it. They won a crucial number in percentage in the election. But nevertheless, we're talking about people that have been educated by the Muslim Brotherhood for many years, using the dawah, various kind of even brainwashing and so on and so forth. And then they reflect whatever they induce to those people, and now they're being regarded as the defenders. And when we are talking about the defenders of human rights, it's not the Western democratic way of understanding human rights. This is human rights by the translation of the Sharia. And if you have to be punished for betrayal in your marriage, this is not protecting human rights by the Western democratic liberal perception.
Thank you, Boaz. We're still on the ICT Roundtable discussion on IDC Radio 106.2 FM. Now I want to turn and go back to our original question on the rise of these two movements that are rising in parallel throughout the region, the Muslim Brotherhood that Reuven just analyzed, and the second one is the Salafist. Assaf, would you like to discuss a little bit for us what is the ideology and goals of the Salafi movement, and also to discuss whether they have a relevancy to the so-called Arab Spring?
Yes, the Salafi movement, excuse me, the Salafi movement, as we discussed it today, its origins actually go back to the late 19th century, when it was originally really a reformist Salafi movement, a movement that whose main idea was to reconcile Islam with the forces of modernity. But in the course of about 100 years, the reformists within the Salafi movement have weakened, and the Salafi movement nowadays is really known for being a movement that is certainly trying to establish states that are governed by Sharia law, which it has in common with the Muslim Brotherhood. But perhaps the guiding principle of the Salafi movement is a very particularistic notion of Tawheed, the unity of God. Now, of course, all Muslims, Islam is a monotheistic religion. All Muslims believe that there is only one God. But for the Salafists, that notion of Tawheed has a very practical side to it, because it means that for Salafis, you cannot participate in elections, for example, or you cannot take any steps that symbolize man-made laws. You can only follow God's laws, you can only follow the Quran, the Hadith, and so forth. Now, the main difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi movement, in my opinion, is one of method, because the Muslim Brotherhood, again, it shares some similar goals. It wants to create states that are run by Sharia law, but it's primarily a reform movement as it sees itself, and it certainly also participates in the political process. For the Salafi movement, on the other hand, has until very recently has shunned the political process, because engaging in the political process was an infringement on the principle of Tawheed. So this is a new development. We see, in a sense, that the Salafi movement, we can perhaps say that it has entered the time of globalization, where now some Salafis have recognized they cannot but also start to enter the political process. So it's a very, very interesting development.
Thank you, Assaf. That leads us to a transition here, and we're here to discuss the so-called Arab Spring, but also its ramification on terrorism. When nowadays we discuss global terrorism, we discuss Al-Qaeda. So my question to you, Boaz, is whether Al-Qaeda was influenced by the Arab Spring. A so-called academic said that the Arab Spring had a negatively influence on Al-Qaeda, that Al-Qaeda was weakened by that. Do you agree with this assessment, and what's your take on that?
Well, we see Al-Qaeda in the recent years, I would say. I wouldn't say inactive, but less active that compared to what many experts expected Al-Qaeda to be. There are many reasons for that. One of the reasons has nothing to do with the Arab Spring itself. I think it's the outcome of a very successful counterterrorism campaign that was conducted against Al-Qaeda, which ended by the killing of bin Laden and al-Awlaki and other prominent or archi-terrorists altogether. Nevertheless, I'm asking myself what is the ultimate goal that Al-Qaeda set to itself. And the ultimate goal that Al-Qaeda set to itself is creating a world regime that will be controlled by the Sharia law. It's a global revolution. Of course, it has its local ramifications and local campaigns and so on and so forth. With this and the other variations that we heard today from Assaf, from Reuven, and knowing that there is a huge difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists, this ultimate goal is shared by those elements. So anyone who see the Arab Spring as contradictory to the inspirations, ultimate inspirations, root causes of Al-Qaeda, I think is mistaken.
Assaf, do you share this assessment?
I think that I think that the origins of the Arab Spring they're very complex. But I think that when you ask me the question about how the Arab Spring is going to impact Al-Qaeda, I think that initially, I think that the people who have been at the forefront, at least to the people who have taken out to the streets, these were, as Reuven has said, people who were against dictatorships. The Western press tended to label them, young Democrats, perhaps, and that was certainly premature. I think that initially, Al-Qaeda suffered ideologically from the early beginnings in the Arab Spring, because Al-Qaeda's ideology basically had suggested that social change in the Arab and in the Muslim world can only be brought about by violence. But what the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, has shown is that actually a nonviolent movement, at least as it was initially, a nonviolent movement can also bring about change. So I think that initially, at least, the global jihad movement suffered ideologically from the Arab Spring. However, I certainly share Boaz's pessimism as of the long-term likely results. I think that certainly the chances of the Arab Spring leading to democracy in the Arab world is very slim. And so I think that Al-Qaeda certainly, and if Amichai also is correct that we will see a rise in the number of failed states, then Al-Qaeda certainly is an actor that has always been very, very good at exploiting such failed states to achieve its own objectives.
Well, it seemed that in our region, we basically either have dictatorship but relative stability, or else you have Al-Qaeda and global jihad or Muslim Brotherhood affiliate. My question to you, Amichai, what's the lesser of these two evils?
You know, I was recently invited to give a paper at a conference in Berlin in early June on the ramifications of the Arab Spring for the West and for Israel. And the title of my paper is going to be that from an Israeli perspective, the so-called Arab Spring is a mixed curse. You know, we like to speak about mixed blessings, but in this case it's a mixed curse. What do I mean by that? On the one hand, it seems to me that in the realm of conventional warfare, since we have never really had a society, a human society, that has tried to live according to the principles of Sharia law and has managed to thrive technologically, economically. And what we see most dramatically transpire in our region, especially in those countries that have undergone so-called anti-authoritarian or democratic revolutions over the last year, is first and foremost economic disaster, right? I mean, tourism has vanished from Egypt, foreign direct investment has vanished, levels of unemployment are going up. So in the realm of, if we are, what kept Israeli strategic thinkers awake at night in the 50s and 60s was the idea that Arab states are going to overtake us in terms of their quality of their army. those conventional threats have diminished, and they're going to continue to diminish because no society that tries to run itself as a Sharia society will be able to compete with the state of Israel in the first half of the 21st century. So that's the good side of the equation. But on the negative side, this proliferation of state failure in our region, let's look around us. Let's just look at our strategic environment. Look at Gaza. Look at Sinai. Look at the proliferation of jihadist groups that are building up their forces with Iranian support, perhaps with the support of others in Sinai. Look at the flow of weapons that's going to come from Libya, which is now in chaos, through Sudan, which is also in chaos.
Coming
already, into Sinai, into Gaza. Look at what we've experienced this past week with the waves and the barrages of missiles landing on Israeli civilian populations. So we're going to see a proliferation of non-conventional threats. A lot of how serious those non-conventional threats are going to be will depend on the strength of Iran. And will depend on the proliferation of weapons in the region. But there's no doubt that on the one hand, we're witnessing a diminishing of conventional military threats on Israel, and simultaneously the evolution of new non-state actor-driven, failed state actor-driven new threats. So we're living in a very dynamic and increasingly lawless strategic environment, and we're going to have to adapt to this environment.
Stevie,
Thank you.
I
Reuven,
would like
something?
just to comment 2 points about the Salafis and Al-Qaeda. First of all, I'm not sure that we know today how to define Al-Qaeda. I mean, Al-Qaeda Central, the old Al-Qaeda. And on the other hand, we have a growing activity in Africa. Nigeria, there are already suicide bombings. There are a lot of kidnapping in the sub-Sahara countries. There are a lot of terrorist operations in the Yemen with no connection to the problems against the President Saleh and the spring or winter in the Yemen. There's a lot of activity still in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So Al-Qaeda,
I would add to that, Reuven, to what you've said, the connection, the strengthening of the connection between Iran and Al-Qaeda as well. It's also...
Yes, it's also maybe... I would say, let's say, elements in Iran. I'm not sure that when we say Iran, by the way, it's the regime or it's something inspired by Khamenei or Ahmadinejad. But something that worries me concerning the Salafis is the rise of the Salafis from nowhere sometimes. I mean, the fact that suddenly we have in Egypt 20% of support for the Salafis.
27% of the seats in parliament.
El-Nur, the Salafist party. There is a new Salafist party now in the Yemen. During the past year, the only demonstrations we saw in Jordan were of Salafists. They were oppressed by the government, by the army, and I'm not... What I'm concerned of is that among these Salafis, there will be the rise of the new political front of Al-Qaeda or global jihad. What I mean is something like, maybe I exaggerate, but something like the IRA and Sinn Féin in North Ireland.
Or the real IRA and the IRA.
Or the real IRA, yes. Something that will develop, because the Salafis are right now composed of personalities. They are not. This is not like the Muslim Brotherhood, a strict ideology or communal leadership, and there are many rivals within them, and it might create, like we see in Gaza. The opposition to Hamas is not going back to the Fatah, but they are moving forward, if we can say it, to support Al-Qaeda or the ideology of Al-Qaeda.
I want to turn now to Assaf and ask you, Assaf, if you see a possible coalition between these two movements. Do you see really that these two movements will join hands together and start to work on a political front, at least, to go into the political arena and start a political process together as a coalition?
So, I think that first of all, it's important to understand again the differences between the two, because I think that a lot of people in the media and also in other places are lumping many Islamist movements together, and there are very, very important differences as we discussed. And I think that it's important for us as scholars and analysts to remind everybody that there are real and fundamental differences between members of the Salafi movement and members of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. Another difference, for example, is that the Salafi movement is a movement that's fundamentally really focused on the individual, as opposed to the large. It's really about converting each and every individual Muslim. And by the way, there are also very, very important differences, of course, between Salafis and Salafi jihadists. So when I say Salafis, I don't mean supporters of Al-Qaeda. There are very, very important differences. I doubt that there's going to be certainly any long-term chance of cooperation between the two. The splits between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, they go back a long time. They have been codified into books written both by members of the Muslim Brotherhood as well as by members of Al-Qaeda, for example, like Zawahiri. However, I also as a social scientist, but also as a rational person, I would never say never, because until a year ago, the conventional wisdom was that the Salafis are never going to enter the political process. But before you know it, they enter the political process. So things can change. But certainly there is a lot of there's no love lost between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi movement. So any long-term cooperation, I'm very, very doubtful.
Amichai, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think we're entering unfamiliar territory because we don't know what these movements are going to be like in power. We know what they're like out of power. We know what they're like as oppositional movements, the dawah, the building up of networks, the building up of either quiet or not so quiet opposition to an existing regime. We don't know how these movements are going to be once they have to, as we always cite the example of, to collect the trash from people's and to provide education and infrastructure and economic growth and so on and so forth. I think that there's great expectations among the Egyptian people that things in the future will be better, and we could very well see a backlash against the new ruling elites if their public needs are not met. Look, here we enter, I think, a very fascinating debate, because whenever we think about these Islamist political parties and movements, we tend to think about the AKP, right, about Turkey, and we see, for example, a relatively successful moderate Islamist party ruling in Turkey. And some people are saying, well, maybe it's not so bad. But I would caution us and to remember that the moderating effect that governmental power has on Islamist groups is dependent on an effective, strong state with other powerful constituencies that can hold these groups to account, either through elections or through other institutions, the military, the judiciary. And when we look at the neighborhood, again, I bring us back to this issue of state capacity and state strength and governance, to see whether we have in Egypt, certainly in Yemen, in other countries, the kind of state institutions that will help push ruling Islamist groups towards moderation rather than towards extremism.
I would just add to that one thought, with your permission. I would argue that that when you see groups that was regarded as extremists in the past, and now they become, as an outcome of this or the other process, they become more centralists. It almost deterministically leads to the pop-up of other groups that they now argue that they represent the real truth.
The vanguard, right? The new
vanguard and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So moving the Muslim Brotherhood into the legitimate center, political center in those countries, in my view, would lead to the new IRA, the new jihadists, the new
and it's
element.
precisely this combination of new political power, anti-liberal ideology, worsening economic conditions. Let's remember Yemen, over 50% of the population of Yemen is under 15 years old. Even before this latest crisis, if we look at the Arab Human Development Reports, these are states in crisis. These are states with a very young, hungry, ambitious, desperate population, young population, that wants to live a better life, that threw out the old sclerotic bums, that now has a new set of leaders. And if those leaders don't deliver, and we see a continuation of the worsening of economic and social conditions, when you put all of this into a cocktail with a lot of weaponry around, with the possible Pakistanization of security forces, Islamists entering into security forces, and the flow of weapons as a result of these transparent borders, we could well see, we might see a moderating effect. But my sense is that because we don't have these strong liberal and state institutions to constrain radicalism, we may very well see a very ugly combination of economic decline, radicalization, splinter groups that become more and more radical, and chaos.
Thank you, Amichai. Reuven,
I would
do you
like
want
to
to comment?
comment about the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that right now we have to remember that we are still in the middle of a process. I don't know if we are already in the middle, maybe only in the start of the process. But the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt seems to be in standby. And during this standby, they look at Turkey. Because in Turkey, there is not only an Islamic government, there is also a very, very secular army or military forces. And we have to remember that in Egypt, except for Mubarak, nothing has changed. In the military, they're the same people. And I would like also to add, we didn't mention here a very important country, which is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, it doesn't seem that Saudi Arabia is going to be, let's say, involved in such a revolution, or if we can foresee the very near future. But Saudi Arabia, especially on the background of what's going on in Iran, became once again the main financier of the Sunni, first of all, Muslim Brotherhood, maybe the Salafis too. They, at least the moderate Salafis, they used to finance in the past. And the Saudi issue, and again, on the background of the conflict with Iran, and they have with Iran the same conflict that we have if Iran is going to be nuclear. And it is also something to add to this troubled water of this process. And just to to give you an example of the, maybe you will say the so-called moderation of the Muslim Brotherhood. So far, the demands, for example, to cut the relations with Israel are very weak. Yet, okay. I say so far.
Thank you.
I don't know.
I want to move now to what's next, and I have two questions on that, and we'll finish in a few minutes on that. The first one, and I'm asking this to you, Assaf. We're now witnessing more or less a decade of fighting against global terrorism. And my question to you is, will this Arab Spring translate into setback in this slow progress against violent extremism?
I think that we cannot separate the impact that the Arab Spring is going to have on these militant groups from the decline that we have seen among Al-Qaeda in general. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that, and this decline is not complete, but in many significant ways there has been a decline, certainly when we speak about Al-Qaeda, the organization. And we know this actually from evidence that was captured from the documents in Abbottabad, that bin Laden was weakening, that he believed that Al-Qaeda, the movement, was weakening, primarily because of the negative reputation that Al-Qaeda had as a result of many Muslims being killed in jihadi violence. I think that I think that Al-Qaeda right now is at a critical juncture. So on the one hand, we have to look at what is going to be the impact of the Arab Spring in terms of the states it's going to create. Are we going to see a growing number of failed states? Because if so, then that certainly is something that will help Al-Qaeda. But on the other hand, I think that there are some issues and some measures that the West can take and has taken and needs to continue to take in order to ensure that we're disregarding what happens with the Arab Spring. Al-Qaeda will continue to weaken. And here I think that the drone attacks on key Al-Qaeda leaders have to continue in order to finish Al-Qaeda essentially off. But again, all that said, we're talking about a movement that goes beyond Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is only a nominal figurehead of the movement. The Al-Qaeda affiliates have strengthened in relation to Al-Qaeda Central. So it's a complicated thing to do.
Thank you, Assaf. We have about 4 minutes left, and I want to pose you a challenge. Moving forward, what recommendation would you provide in terms of adjusting to these new regional realities? And I would like, if possible, each of you to answer this in really 45 seconds to 1 minute. Reuven, starting with you.
Well, it's very difficult to... If you are talking about recommendations for Israel, you mean?
Yeah, from an Israel...
from an Israeli point of view, Assad is fine. I mean, we need stability. Mubarak was fine, Assad was fine. We were not involved in all the problems, internal problems.
The devil we know is better than the devil we don't know.
Yeah, that's right. And besides, since we are going to confront one day Iran, I don't know what is better, if those dictators could indirectly assist us in this conflict, but these governments are too weak, though. The new governments are too weak from our point of view to be of any assistance.
Thank you, Reuven. Amichai?
Continue to develop the Iron Dome system and civil defense. Build a really good fence around the State of Israel. Develop greater drone capabilities so we can strike non-state actors at a longer range, and make sure that we prop up the King of Jordan and continue to really value our relationship, especially with the peace treaty with Egypt and Jordan, because if Jordan falls to chaos, then we are truly surrounded by chaos.
In other words, to continue what we're doing, but to make it at a higher and more effective level. Boaz?
With your permission, I would refer to the global level in answering your question. And we painted quite a gloomy picture here, and I would say it's not deterministically going to that gloomy end. And things can be and should be done in the global arena. I think that there is a need for a kind of a Marshall Plan for these new countries or new regimes in those countries with international support, but this is not in a way of trying to appease those new regimes, just the opposite. Giving them the carrot, but there is also a stick there. If you do not follow a pragmatic process, if you do not promote, or at least not stopping liberal NGOs activities in your countries and liberal processes in your country, then you do not get this type of support. So I would say that there is a lot of things that can be done in the global arena. From an Israeli perspective, I would say we should not abandon the effort to achieve peace with the Palestinians. This will be a great support, and although the process is quite problematic around us, I would not neglect this hope.
Thank you. Assaf, very shortly.
Yeah, I agree with Boaz. I think that we must not stop attempting to negotiate and to talk with our Palestinian friends. I think that in terms of Israel, I think the most important thing to do for Israel is to do nothing, because I think that there are a lot of events in the region over which we have very, very little control, and oftentimes our talk is making the situation worse.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Reuven Paz, Dr. Amichai Magen, Dr. Boaz Ganor, and Dr. Assaf Moghadam to participate in ICT roundtable discussion on 106.2 FM and also on the internet www.1062fm.co.il. I want to thank the technician, Tomer Frischman, our video team, Sasha Mitakov and Lior Peleg, and our producers, Ila Oved and Omer Kedar. Thank you very much.
IDC Radio 106.2 FM. IDC Radio in collaboration with Kol Israel.
Hello and welcome on ICT.